Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Scott Page, who is a professor of management, social science, and complexity at the University of Michigan, also external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute, and the author of a bunch of books. There was one a couple of years ago that you co-authored called Complex Adaptive Systems. I remember that book very well. It's unfortunately down in my office. I don't have it to display. And then there was another book on diversity and complexity. This one called The Difference, which I think really made a big splash when it came out. How the power of diversity creates better groups, firms, schools, and societies. And then I think you have sort of a more concise book that I think it builds on and sort of summarizes the argument in The Difference. It's called The Diversity Bonus, How Great Teams Pay Off in the Knowledge Economy. I think this is more also targeted towards maybe business decision makers, shorter attention span, a little shorter, And then this book, The Model Thinker, What You Need to Know to Make Data Work for You. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Well, there's so many different directions we could go with this. I thought maybe I'd start with the Model Thinker. This book is absolutely fantastic, I have to say. I mean, it's a book that I wish I had when I was in graduate school. And, I remember reading Jim March as part of my organizational theory class in grad school. And, we didn't have a textbook. We had dozens of books and hundreds of articles, and there was no one place that you could go to that had sort of the library. And I think the course on which this book was built or used was, you had another title for it, which is like 32 models that'll make you smarter.
Right.
And I think any grad student would be happy to take a course like this. And it really reminded me of this quote, and I'm not sure if it's apocryphal, but John Maynard Keynes once said that economics, and I think more broadly social science, is the science of model development and the art of model selection. And I think that's really what the theme of this book is. And I think if I were to pair it with your other work, this idea of diversity, it seems like you could have diversity within individuals or across groups of individuals. And, those are sometimes substitutes and sometimes complements for each other. And so if we can't harvest the wisdom of the crowd, then we can try to internalize it somewhat by learning as many models as possible. So, maybe just tell us what inspired this book. I mean, you tell a story at the beginning, but I mean, it seems like a course like the one you're offering should be central to anybody's training in social science.
No, it should be. And I think what drove the course is, I'm from Yankee Springs, Michigan, not even a township, not even a town in Michigan. And I came here as an undergrad, and the card catalog room was bigger than any library I'd ever seen, which is kind of just a scaling. You need a scaling.
I remember those.
I'm like, oh my God. Because I was like, where's the card catalog? And I'm like, I was thinking like one little box, and instead there was a room the size of a library. And at that time, this is 1981, when you came to the University of Michigan, or if you went to Berkeley, you went to Duke, they would say to you, this is the one time in your life you're going to have access to the world's information and knowledge. You should explore the library. This is the only time you'll be able to see these books, touch this knowledge. And that was true. And so I think the education I got was interacting with those materials. And then I came back to Michigan after teaching at Caltech at the University of Iowa. I came back as a faculty member in 2000, and that didn't make sense. I mean, you kind of want to give back, and you want to be like, okay, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to change these people's lives the same way the university changed my life. And then you realize they've got everything. Then the phones didn't quite exist, but now they have everything on their phone. So they don't need. They need our library, but it's a different experience. And so then you think, what do they really need? And they need, in some sense, as you were saying, ways to make sense of all that data, all that information, frameworks. And so I started teaching the modeling class for the social sciences using Laven March's book. But that was, as you know, written before there was network analysis, written before any complexity theory, really all sorts of, learning models were just getting started. And at some point I mentioned to Michael Cohen and then talked to Jim March and said, I think there kind of needs to be a new book. And March is like, you got to write it. But kind of nervous, right? You don't want to, following up on Jim March is not kind of where you want to go. Um, but it was a great opportunity. And I kind of took a different approach than I think March has a coherent narrative through his, Believe in March have a coherent narrative. I viewed this more as like a Forrest Gump trip to the zoo, box of chocolates, so you can just like read. I wanted to make each chapter self-contained. So if someone's like, I want to know what a Markov process is, I want to know what a network model is, they can just read the chapter. It also makes it really nice for teaching because you can say to a student, like, if you didn't get that, okay, fine, let it go, try and pick it up before the final. Next week, we're on to something else. So you could just have each lecture just be a separate model and you can just kind of engage with it, think about it. And the idea is, hopefully then people leave there with multiple ways of thinking about things.
Yeah, and I think that the quote that I gave you from John Maynard Keynes, I mean, I don't think that actually completely describes the project, because this idea of selecting the right model for each problem, I mean, it sort of adheres to that one-to-one thinking that
Right.
you are critical of, right? In other words, and this goes back to the different benefits of diversity, right? One benefit is that you have a team. There's going to be someone on a team that has, right, the way of thinking that you
Right.
need,
Yeah, yeah,
right,
yeah.
as opposed to thinking in sort of ensemble terms where you are really attacking a problem from multiple directions at the same time. So it seems like you would have to supplement Keynes by saying there's the science of model development, the art of model selection, but also the craft of model blending, right?
Right. No, absolutely. And I think I mean, in the book, I sort of said, and in class, I would always say there's kind of two ways to think about models. One is to kind of like one to many, where you just have this thing, you think of it as a hammer, and you do try and turn everything into a nail and just say, okay, if I did a linear regression on this, what would I find? If I thought of this as a Markov process, what would that yield? Right. And both of those are really powerful because a linear regression will at least just tell you kind of like, okay, what things significantly matter, right? What things are just even, let's set causality aside, what things are just correlated with the outcome that interests me. And with a Markov model, it's kind of saying like, if there's a finite number of states and if there's fixed transitions between those states for the most part, then there's a unique equilibrium. You know where the system's going to go. And so if you want to argue that an intervention is going to matter, you kind of have to argue that it's not a Markov process, right? I mean, a little bit, right? So that kind of like having a couple models, really well and applying them to absolutely everything, and then being critical and saying, okay, it works here, it doesn't work there, is super useful. But then the second thing is that the kind of many to one is that a lot of the things that are challenging from a policy perspective, from a scientific perspective, are complex because we solve the simple stuff. So that means if you think of from an information theory, what's the information content of this? It's huge. Models, by definition, like if you take something like inequality, it's a complex problem, right? Or the environment, it's a complex problem. Models are simple. So there's no way you can explain something complex with something simple. You're kind of explaining a 16 with a 3 or something. You just can't, if the problem is this big and your model's this big, you can't get it all. But if you have a bunch of models in conversation with one another, then I think you can potentially, reach, a deeper understanding. You can predict better, right? It becomes, I think it's a better way to advance science. And so it's really an exercise. I tried to stay away from these words just because but it's kind of a scientific pluralism in a way, right? That
Yeah.
I'm advocating, but I'm doing it in a particular statistical way to try and I think it's very important you try and make these cases quantitatively and theoretically, so that like you're not just using words, you're actually formally defining what it is that you're doing and then saying, if you assume this, then you get this.
Right. Now, I just got finished teaching my core strategy class for my executive MBAs, and I sort of had to give a little speech at the end. And the speech was really a plea for the relevance of models and frameworks. And I was saying, look, the reason why you come to an academic institution to learn about business is because that's sort of our unique superpower, is the ability to provide
Right.
these practitioners with frameworks. And while this book is really targeting, I think, social scientists, what is the benefit of model thinking for people who are out in the world, right, trying to get things done and make sense of things?
Yes, I think that like what's really useful, I think, is for someone who's like a policy person or a business person, like when I go talk to people in those spaces about like how they're using the book and how they're using modeling generally is one is that they often might just use like simple frameworks, like they might use something like a Porter five forces model or something like this, right? And they in the model, the book is forcing them, I think, this book is forcing them to think a little more deeply about things. So, for example, you can think one early section just talks about the shape of things to come. Like typically, I know something's increasing or decreasing. But I don't know. Is it diminishing returns? Is it increasing returns? Is it linear? Is there a threshold? And then how would I know that? Well, you actually have to have some underlying model of what would have to what has to be true for something to have a threshold, what has to be true for something to have diminishing returns. And so I think getting them to kind of go one level deeper than beyond just kind of like direction, you have to have a model. The other thing I think is really useful about it is, and this is the thing, it's honestly, if you say what surprised me the most about the book, it's this, is that I have almost a throwaway section on the distinction between variance and entropy. So variance is a measure of dispersion around the mean, right? Entropy is a measure of uncertainty or surprise. So if I said, okay, you want to have a mean of 5 and things are between 0 and 10, and you want to maximize variance, you'd put half at 0, half at 10.
Yeah.
So you get as much dispersion as possible. But there's not a lot of uncertainty there because it's either 0 or 10, right? It's like a coin flip. But if I want to maximize entropy, which is uncertainty, I'd make it a uniform distribution between 0 and 10. And I have so many people just go, oh my God, like I've been using variance to mean uncertainty my
Right.
whole life. And they'll be like, is that wrong? Like, it's crazy. Some people say, like, you say that in the book, and then I looked on the internet and it said the same thing. And like, it seems like everybody who knows about this says, yes, variance is not uncertainty. And they want me to just like give them a stamp and say, yes, that's right. Everybody says this is true. It is true. But it's just, and part of this, I think, is an artifact of when it's path dependence. When we taught risk, we used variance, from the 1950s and 60s because it was just too complicated to use entropy. And we didn't have that much data, and a lot of things were kind of normally distributed, and so close enough, right? But now when there's a lot of like long tail distributions and you're making, strategic choices, you really, really want to think about that distinction starts mattering a lot, right? And so there's little things like that there's a formalism that comes from just saying like uncertainty, surprise, to some sort of statistical measure, variance, entropy, that, if you're going to make decisions absent a model, right? You're just taking huge risks, right? I mean, it's got to be, the old saying, "In God we trust, all else bring data." I'd go one level deeper. Data without models is, because of selection bias, because of strategic effects, right? Like I think it's in the models like Harry Parsh, a former colleague of mine, has this data set where he looks at like how many trees you cut down as a function of wage. And the more you pay people, the fewer trees they cut down. You're like, that doesn't make any sense. But then you
Right.
realize they're setting the wage depending on how hard it is to cut down the trees,
Uh-huh.
right? So it's really
Yeah.
hard to cut down the trees. The wage per tree is higher. If
Right.
it's easy to
Right.
cut down the trees, the wage per tree is lower. But if you just ran a regression, you'd say, boy, if we really want people to cut down trees really fast, let's pay them very little money. So I think that like you've really got to kind of, and I begin with a Munger quote, right? Charlie, you've got to array your experiences and your data on a lattice of models.
Well, and it seems also that if you learn more models, then you get better at sort of setting boundary conditions, right? Because you can sort of see the limitations of each model from the outside, right?
Oh no, absolutely right. And you can see, like I think that in the in the first version of the book, that I ended just with a chapter on kind of inequality. In the later version, I added a chapter on COVID because I'd written it before COVID. And the inequality is just fascinating, right? Because there's 12 or 13 kind of empirically grounded models that kind of explain it, but they're all very different explanations. I mean, some is on selective mating, some is on, returns to human capital, some of it has to do with discrimination, some has to do with political power, and each one of these kind of like, you know, from Piketty to Stiglitz, each one of these explains some of the variation, but not all of it. And it's difficult because like I end by saying it's really humbling, when you sort of actually try to think of something to a lot of ones is you just realize like, man, I just don't know that much about it. The problem is it's hard to writing. You should be humble's a hard thing to, it typically doesn't land that well, but still that was my overwhelming reaction after finishing the book is, wow, I just don't know very much.
Yeah.
because,
Right.
and this is the thing actually, Elaine Landemore, who's a political philosopher at Yale, she wrote a paper on this. I'll be honest, I don't fully understand the paper because she's political philosopher, French political philosopher. What is we talk about is like, so suppose you're a Keynesian, and suppose I'm a real business cycle person. Suppose you spent 25 years being a Keynesian, and I spent 25 years in a real business cycle. There's no Habermasian like strength of the stronger argument. We're not going to know who's really got the stronger argument necessarily. Because I can't possibly in a 20-minute conversation, or even if I've had experience with, people who've understood your framework, I'm still not going to get it the way you get it. Right. And so what you realize is that like to be a real expert, and that's what's so amazing, right, with the academy now. Like, if I'm interested in like reinforcement learning, there's people who spent 30 years studying that, who know the ins and outs, who've written thousands of models, who've literally, hundreds of models, played with hundreds or thousands of data sets, right? Who deeply, deeply understand it. And with the model, I'm going to have a huge improvement over not having the model, but I'm not going to have an understanding at the level of other people. And I sent chapters where I felt like I had less expertise. I sent chapters to people who are experts, just saying like, how bad is this? I don't like getting the main part right. That was my concern. In almost every case, people are like, yeah, this is exactly right, but it's wrong because if you go two levels deeper, and I'm like, I know.
Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, what we want some kind of, I don't know, Uber model, right? Which tells us, which model to use, right? In what combination. And a part of, I think, the story you're telling is that there is a trade-off between having, say, a whole bunch of different specialized models working together, and then some, big model which tries to incorporate everything. And I think this gets to us as scholars. I mean, we have a choice to make. We can either be, deep specialists and become one to many people,
right,
or we can be more generalists, right, and be, I guess, more of a many to one person. Is there, I don't know, different conditions under which we would want to have a committee of specialists, and other conditions where we would perhaps be better off having a whole bunch of generalists examining a problem?
This is a great question. Let me, and this is where it gets to, something that's in your domain more than mine, and I just find super fascinating. It relates to kind of like corporate culture and norms and this sort of stuff, right? And how you formulate strategy. But let's take drug development as an example, right? When you're thinking about, okay, which molecules do we focus on, these sort of things, you actually probably need, and let's take even like crop development. So if you go to some place like Monsanto, they kind of have two classes of experts. I mean, there's people who, the clean ones and the dirty ones, is one of my friends says. There's people who operate in clean rooms with golden guns doing genetics, and they're like in the white suits. It looks like, they're curing diseases. And then there's people like literally getting their hands dirty, both in the northern and southern hemisphere, so they can plant year round, where they're actually putting the crops in soil and seeing what's happening, right? And there's a tremendous expertise within each of those communities of scholars, but there's kind of those two types, right? But now let's stay kind of within that same industry and ask, do we take this to market? Or in the case of pharma, do we try and get government approval for it, or increasingly with genetically modified crops, you may have to. Now you suddenly need people who understand how will consumers respond to this. If it's a drug, if it's a molecule, you have to understand like how difficult will this protocol be for the people who are going to get this medicine to follow, right? So it's Ozempic is very different than taking a pill, right? You've got what's the downside risk. You got to understand people who kind of know social media think about, okay, if something really went bad, could that blow the whole thing up? You need people who understand the political process. You need people who understand the cost of building production facilities. You need people who understand like how demand curves spike. You need people who understand like how tight will this patent be, patent lawyers. So then you really need a crowd of experts with incredibly diverse kind of expertise in decision making. I think where this gets challenging, where universities are in a real challenge with respect to business, and I'm more comfortable kind of in the business policy environment in this way, in that selection is so important. So diversity without selection, right? Without, Greg, thank you for sharing, but that's how bad I see it. Right? Without some red teaming, right? And without some weighting, and this, like I was talking before, like, if you're giving me this Keynesian view of things, or you're giving me this, you're saying, no, look, there's a real risk of this happening or something. I got to push you on that. I got to push you on that. And I think in universities at the moment, there's this kind of, less scientific pluralism, kind of more of a value pluralism argument to like, let's all listen to everybody. Let's validate everybody. We want to encourage all these voices, which is true, right? And maybe in an academic environment, that's kind of where you want to be. You want to be fomenting this stuff. But at some point, if there's not selection, right, and there's not weighting, I mean, you're not going to get anywhere. And I
Yeah.
think that what I find kind of fascinating, right? My younger son jokes that like they say, "What do your parents do?" And he says, like, my mom is like a world's expert on federalism and separation of powers and that sort of stuff. And my dad says simple things to smart people. And typically what I'm saying in the academy is we need a little more selection. And in the business space, I'm saying you need a little more diversity.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
I think they're both erring. Now, interested in your take on this, right? Because you're in these two worlds as well, right? I think business tends to get a little bit like, okay, we've got the answer here. Like we've nailed this. And the academy tends to be, everybody's got an idea. And I think the best spot is probably between those two.
well, I would actually emphasize a different contrast, which is
Yeah.
I think within academy, we really reward specialization,
Oh, yeah.
right? Because
Absolutely.
we have a really good way of evaluating performance in that direction. And being a generalist is tough, right? It's something you can do once you have tenure, and you're emeritus and so forth. But in business, I think because there is this enormous pressure to succeed in the
Yeah.
marketplace, being a generalist is actually, rewarded. It's one of the few areas I think is where being a generalist and having a good understanding of a lot of different domains is going to lead to success, right? As a manager.
Oh, yeah. No, and this is the thing. I won't call out names. I mean, but there are people, like when you talk to people in finance, private equity, VC, which I think people in the academy tend to think of as almost like evil people in a way, right? From the humanities side, these are Renaissance people in a way. I mean, they understand the energy sector, they understand the pharmaceutical sector, they understand fashion, culture, politics, because they have to, right? Um, if you're tossing down, $100 million bets, $1 billion bets on things, you have to understand the economy, you have to understand society, you have to understand social movements, you understand politics, you understand technology. It's I think it can be kind of like just um, really rewarding as a professor when you realize that like people who make it to the top in business or positions of influence, like the top per se in business and in politics and the nonprofit sector, these people read widely. These people are interested in all sorts of different phenomena. They've got deep takes on a lot of things. I think there's a perception that there's a narrowness there that I just don't see. Now that, yeah, there are people like, doing Bitcoin trading and hedge fund trading. They're noise
Right.
traders, flash people. Yeah, okay, set them aside, right? Although they do know there's an entropy invariance. Those people,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
but if you meet a CEO of a company, wow, super thoughtful people,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I mean, you draw some interesting parallels between, um, evaluating and deciding using algorithms and evaluating and deciding using social processes,
Yeah,
right? So, in particular, you talk about ensembles and
yeah,
how powerful ensembles are in the world of data science. And in a way, any kind of group decision making is or could be ensemble decision making. And
right.
so, what can we learn from data science, let's say, or information processing in the algorithmic space that can be applied to information processing and decision making in the organizational space?
So I think a lot. I think that's a great question. I think that and I think as AI gets better and we learn how to use it to manage better, there'll be even more. But let me start simple and go a little bit more complex to the frontier. So simple thing is, if you think about when I'm doing Bayesian model averaging or something, so I take a bunch of models and then I'm going to weight them based on how accurate they are. One thing that we learn is that it works a little bit better than simple averaging, but kind of what's most important is throwing the really bad models off the bus,
Right.
right? Like
So
there's
so
just,
there's
yeah,
so there's the basic wisdom of the crowd
yeah,
idea where you just
right,
take a bunch of individual perspectives and you
right.
just kind of throw them into some equally weighted function and it cranks out a prediction that is usually better than right
Yeah.
any
So it has,
individual
right.
predictor.
So mathematically, we can show it has to be better than the average person in the crowd, right? That's just a mathematical fact. But what we know now that we kind of didn't know then a little bit is that um, you don't really get much beyond, you know, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You're not gaining that much because there's just not that, even though there's a lot of ways to think about things, there's typically not more than 10, 11, 12. But, this is some, Jack Soul and some people at Duke have, done this nice stuff in the wisdom of select crowds. And I think that's kind of like
Yeah.
where the current thinking is, which is that, you know, what you really want to do is you want to kind of like get 30, 40 people together, figure out, and Phil Tetlock has done a lot of work on this as well, and then figure out, okay, who are the best, 8 or 9? But you got to be careful because you want to make sure they're not thinking about it the same way.
Yeah. You want to curate your crowd,
You want to
right?
curate your crowd, right? And I think so. But here's what I do this like it's almost like a parlor trick. I mean, it's not. It's an algorithm, but it seems like a parlor trick or it's a process. So I'll bring in a set of people, and I want to get across them the importance of diverse ways of thinking, and I'll give them like a ridiculously hard. I mean, like how many road miles are there in Texas? Where a road mile is a single lane of a road. So 4-lane highway would be
Yeah.
4 road miles. And I'll say, okay, each person has like 5 minutes. But I'm like, okay, but you need to write down what facts are you assuming and like what is your model. And so it's incredibly important. So when I average those, I'll get something that's typically within a factor of like 5 of the actual number, which is really impressive because, right? But then I have them, I say, okay, everybody just explain your model, first what your facts were to everybody else. And so sometimes people have like the wrong size of Texas. Like something like Texas is 500 miles by 500 miles. It's like, no, it's not quite that big, right? Or Texas is 50 miles by 50 miles. Or they'll realize like actually making it a square doesn't work. And there'll be some people whose models are like, imagine just a lattice of roads across Texas. Other people's models will be like, well, there's 9 cities in Texas and they have this much, and they'll have like a city rural model. And so then what they do is they kind of like typically then make new estimates based on having these
Mm.
conversations. And then they'll decide, like, okay, let's throw out, like, this one just doesn't make sense. It was 10 times higher than everybody else's. Or they'll say, oh, wait, this is the only one that makes sense
Yeah.
because it's 10 to 10.
But it's important to have those conversations after the individuals have an opportunity to,
Right,
create their models, right?
right.
So, I mean, I cook a
That's
lot,
the
and
key.
often and there's a big debate in cooking when you're making soup. Do you want to cook all the ingredients separately and then add them together at the last minute, or do you want to
Yeah,
throw
yeah,
them all
yeah.
in the pot from the get go? And oftentimes, if you throw them all in the pot from the get go, then it just becomes this like muddy, everything tastes the same.
No, and I think that like I think that, I mean, I absolutely agree. And I think that you get this thing where sometimes somebody has an idea or has something they know that they never would have shared. Like I was doing one like Walmart's in Ohio, and one the numbers were all coming out like at one table it was like 1,000, 1,200, 900, 700. Someone goes, I don't know anything about Walmart's, but my sister referees high school volleyball in Ohio, right? And this is straight up Annie Duke, outside the, taking an outside view. And she's like, there's 600 high schools in Ohio that have volleyball. There can't be more Walmarts than high schools. There can't be. That can't be true.
Right.
Right? That can't be true. And so everybody else was like, yeah, like we use this, I did counties and,
Right.
you're right. There can't be more Walmarts than high school. You just,
Mhm.
like, you think how big, and so then they, adjusted their numbers down and and then they ended up being within 2. Like they just like
Right.
361 and the number was 359. And it's just, and so there's, so people like Phil Tetlock, they teach these process of coming up with good decisions. And I think what you really want to do is you want to like train people in protocols for making decisions, but have those protocols not be so, tight and specific that everybody's doing the same thing. Like one
Yeah.
thing I find really kind of not nonsensical, but it's problematic is that you'll say, okay, we're evaluating this tenure case, we're evaluating this project. So all of you follow this same rubric. Well, then all you're really trying to do is in some sense get rid of noise. Right. And this is what, Danny Kahneman was working on kind of at the end of his life was like noise
Yeah.
reduction. But you don't just want
But that's an artificial noise. It's got an artificial noise reduction.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And what you really want though is like that you want to make sure the protocol has enough flexibility in it that people can say, here's I've got this different angle on this thing. And this then though requires giving people time and space. But let's go back to this culture part, which I think is so fascinating. Like, how then do you create a culture where people bring it, right? And then at the same time, they feel, when you want to call it safety, whatever, but they feel like, okay, I care so much about the answer being correct, and I care so little about me being correct that I want to, that I'm really willing to be criticized. That's hard. Now let's go to the thing we originally phrased the question with like AI. Here's where it gets really, I think, hard from a management standpoint, is where I see AI is starting to play a larger role, and I think it'll play an even larger role. Is we're going to be making some decision, and somebody's going to say, well, this reminds me of the product introduction that Kraft did in 2004. And when that happens, somebody's going to say, oh, Greg, who's in our Cincinnati office, worked on that. And you're just going to get brought into the meeting. So one thing that AI changes, Zoom changed the fact that we don't have to be in the same physical place. But AI means that you can have literally everybody in your organization in the waiting room for a meeting. And you can dynamically bring people in. So if you look at, so what it means is you can have dynamic allocation of people to test. So you could be in the process of making a decision, and the AI could say, I'm seeing there's so much entropy of reason right now, right? That I think we actually need to break through into 2 smaller groups or something and do these things. Or there's so much groupthink going on. Like either you shouldn't have had this meeting because it's so straightforward, or let's bring in 2 people who have not been in this conversation, who are really wise, and see if they like immediately jump to the thing that you have all converged on. So I think this notion of kind of like having, we all know AI can do these really nice knowledge maps, right? But the question is when you start linking people to the knowledge maps and start saying, we can dynamically bring people into the meeting and get their feedback. Now you suddenly are curating the AI. So I think AI's ability to curate, to your point, is amazing. And now let's put the culture thing in. How do I not feel like a gadget? How do I not feel like some sort of widget that the AI is using? And I think this is where I think creating the right organizational team culture is going to be really important.
Yeah. So this gets back to waiting, right? So,
Yeah.
not every not every opinion is equally valid, or not every insight or piece of
Yeah,
information is equally important. And so you
right.
need to come up with some weighting function or some routing function, right? So I remember when ChatGPT was first introduced, it was really terrible at math, you
Yeah,
know, and so, it would make sense for the ChatGPT to say, you know what, this is a math question.
right.
So I'm just going to, route this over to Wolfram Alpha,
Yeah,
which is a specialized
right,
tool,
right, right.
and then I'm going to, deliver the result, right? So knowing kind of which specialist, so to speak, you want to route the problem to. I mean, that's sort of like a meta skill.
Oh, absolutely. And I also think that like the knowing who, like, how do you kind of like profile like your knowledge space, my knowledge space, your expertise, my expertise, this sort of things, and how do you learn? Um, how do we? I think we're going to fundamentally see changes in organizational structure. And for example, a lot of organizations, including universities, have like committees that decide particular things, and it's the same 7 people to make these decisions. That probably doesn't make sense. That structure was based on a world in which you had to physically be in the same spot, right? Which you don't have to anymore. The other thing I think that's really kind of wild that's changing is we also don't have to be sequential anymore. So to your point, which I think is prescient, like this idea you want personal people to share. Here's like what I call the algebra of there's a rectangle of simultaneous conversations. Suppose you have 40 people making a decision, right? And like let's say 20. So you're in the room and you've got 2 hours allocated to that decision. So in that 2 hours, maybe at most an hour and 10 minutes of content, right? Because people are going to repeat things, support other things. Suppose you first said, okay, I want everybody before the meeting starts to just speak for 10 minutes about what you think is important. So now immediately I've got 200 minutes of content that has no past dependence to it at all, right? And the AI can create some sort of knowledge map. And then the AI could say, okay, here's what people mentioned. And we could all vote. I mean, we could even just see parts of it, right? And we could vote for, you could do like Matt Salgana kind of stuff like, great, did you prefer A or B? Did you prefer C or D? Like you just do some sort of heat mappy things, right? We're giving us selections of the sets of ideas. So in another 10 minutes, let's suppose that 50 ideas were presented. We can get some loose ranking of those. So now we spent 20 minutes and we've got 200 minutes of content and 200 minutes of analysis. So it's 400 minutes as opposed to 70. So we got 6 times the amount of intellectual content. And we've still got an hour and a half left, right? But I think the challenge is, so the promise is there, but how do you create, you know, I think, culture is probably too weak a word here, but how do you create sort of like processes, protocols, give people time to be prepared, get people to learn to enjoy working in those systems, to feel like, wow, we're coming up with great answers here. And there is also, John Seeley Brown and I talk about this a lot. Like there's this, one reason we have conversations is that we can build off what somebody else said. So if we're all just talking at the same time, we can't do that. How do you balance those sorts of things, right? I think it's a real challenge, but I think we're going to move away from, sequential in-person meetings to simultaneous diverse meetings. And to my earlier point about like, you could loop someone in. The really weird thing is like, you could have people 5 minutes into them making, saying, here's what they think is important. And you could get looped into the meeting even though you weren't at the meeting because I could quickly figure out like, oh, wait a minute, this is totally in Greg's spot. He wasn't one of the people originally let in, but let's bring him in.
These are like human hyperlinks, right?
Yeah, no, but the AI can just, just dragging you into a meeting,
Right.
right?
Well, I think you mentioned John Seeley Brown. I think you're the John Seeley Brown professor of something.
Yeah. Well, he owes me big because like it's a distinguished university professorship, and so I can name it after anybody. So he didn't even have to pay for the thing. He doesn't
Oh,
even buy
wow.
me dinner yet. He did buy me
He could if he wanted to. Right?
Yes.
Well, I mean, look, I think in your work, you really articulate state of the art with respect to thinking about diversity. And I guess there's a couple of themes that I hope we could touch on. One is, how do we measure diversity, right?
Right.
What are the relevant features that we should
Right,
be
right,
looking for in diversity, which obviously depend on the nature of the problem. But we can dig into this idea of cognitive or perspectival or informational diversity. But then the other question I would have is, a lot of us go around thinking that diversity is all about selection, right? But it can also be about treatment, right?
right.
So how do we, cultivate diversity? And also, if we do have selection, we do inherit sort of a bunch of diverse views. How do we prevent them from the treatment eliminating the diversity,
Right.
right? So, I'm thinking about university. We say, oh, let's admit people from all these different places with all these different perspectives so that we can have a university environment that's full of diversity. But then at the end of the day, we're cranking out University of Michigan people. And so now at the next level, they're like, no, 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 we need to have like University of Michigan and Berkeley people in order to have our diversity,
You
right? So,
have to, though. This thing I'm really kind of, again, this is kind of like the other Keynes quote, like when the facts change, my opinions change, right? The So if you look at a field like neuroscience, right? Like they can only hold their conventions in Chicago and Vegas or something, right? So there's like this is an understatement, but there's like 70,000 papers written a year in neuroscience. So let's suppose you hire someone from Princeton who's amazing, and the next year as a postdoc, and the next year you're hiring someone else, and they say, "I've got this guy who's just as good as Sheila you hired last year." But then you realize, like, wait, they've been in this journal club, they've been in your lab. Maybe they read maybe 200 articles a year, right? That they understood. And that's being very optimistic. But let's just this the case. That means over the last 5 years, each one has learned 1,000 papers, and there's an overlap of 800. And those are filtered to their experiences and other training, that sort of thing. But during that time, 360,000 papers were written. And you can say, well, not all of them are equally good, but still, if I take someone from Michigan or take someone from Illinois or take someone from Berkeley or someone, they probably have very little overlap, or they may overlap on like 100. And so it just doesn't make sense to hire two people from Princeton. It just can't make
well,
sense.
but so the question then is, at the university level, do you want to? I mean, because if you try to promote diversity within your department,
Yeah.
then it kind of prevents the emergence of, say, the Michigan school,
Right. No,
or
that's
the
right. That's
the
right.
Chicago school, and so to
Right.
some extent, you want to have the Chicago school and the MIT school, so that you can really dig deep into those perspectives,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah. But I'm saying if I'm Genentech or something, right?
Yeah,
I don't want to hire two Berkeley, because not that they're not
yeah,
about advancing knowledge, but yeah, but I think that no, you're absolutely right. I think there's within. I mean, again, this is the explore exploit trade off, right? There is a sense in which you may want to say, like Michigan could say, our anthropology department is going to be a full 5 factor. We're going to do biological, cultural, archaeology. We're going to do all
right.
five. We do all five well, and we're going to train students that have that breadth. And then you've got to hire with that in mind. You've made an ontological commitment to this is what we think anthropology is. That's great. Whereas you can imagine a sociology department of some schools saying, look, we are purely data driven, right? We are just absolutely going to, and that makes sense, right? Because there really are, and then you need other schools focusing on other things. But then when you think about the end of the day, when a decision has to be made, when a government's making a decision, when a firm is making a decision, university is making a decision or something, you then want to call in, you know, a diverse set of, people trained from different places, right?
Yeah. I mean, when I hear people talk about how, UC Berkeley has admitted the most diverse class in its history, I rankle a little bit because there's no modifier in front of that,
Right,
right? Because if you're saying it's more diverse, it means that you have some metric and it's measuring something. And I think most of us, when we use the term, are referring to, identity diversity as
right,
using the standard categories. Um, but without that modifier, one might think it could be all sorts of
right.
diversities, right? So maybe talk about what we know about, I guess, cognitive diversity, what we know about perspectival and informational diversity, and do we need to start with the decision or the goal, and then work backwards to the type of diversity we need?
I think if you, if if you're at the FOMC or you're at if you're making decisions for a government agency or a firm, or if you're designing rockets or something like that, then absolutely you want to be thinking really carefully about curating diverse sets of people to work in your team. Like my most recent paper with Lu Hong essentially shows that unless you're picking people for like a 4x100 relay team, there is no test you could apply to individuals such that the best team consists of the people who score highest on the test. So first we show, this is kind of surprising, if there is a test, the test has to be equivalent to how would a team of clones of you work? That's the only
Right.
possible.
Right.
So any
Yep.
test turns out to be equivalent to that test. Now, it turns out if you're doing a 4x100 relay, that's how fast are you? Because that would be how fast the four clones of you do.
Well, you talk about additive,
Yeah.
but there's also like negative additive, right? So there's a famous study where you take the best performing, hens and you put them in a cage, and productivity goes off a cliff because
Right.
they
Oh,
fell in time,
yeah.
right?
No,
Or
it's
like
interesting.
I guess the Argentine soccer team, right? You put together the 11 best players and they're terrible.
Yeah, no, that's right. And there's just no, and so you really have to think about, like, it's all about composition. So it's really tricky because, again, you're trying to like you got all these different departments, you want students interested in different things, but I think what I take from that is any sort of simple approach where you're like checking boxes, like we got someone from each state or distribute, those, I think those are, in some ways lazy. I think it's very, very hard though to think like Michigan got 105,000 applications last year, right? You can't possibly read those and compare those and make selections from those. It's just the N is too big, right? So and so you're doing some sort of really somewhat ad hoc but sophisticated filtering mechanism at the first level. And even for grad school, you get so many applications. It's just really, really hard to um solve, I think to have any sort of protocol that's gonna make sense, right? I think it's just a really, really hard problem. It used to be, I was talking to somebody who was a school superintendent, and they were saying in Michigan, and they're saying it used to be great. Like we would get 3 applications. They'd be people who were from the town or the neighboring town. Now we get like 400. But the weird thing is now there's 300 schools that each get 400 applications, where in the past 300 schools each got 3 applications, and the match was probably better, right? Just people were filtering out where they were going to apply. So this Common App thing, which makes it look like, oh, wow, we've got so many applications, has just made the problem a lot harder for schools. And maybe we need to go to something that's more of the matching thing, like medical schools were saying. But then you don't get the composition. It's hard. I think it's just a hard problem.
Well, getting back to the idea of, treatment versus selection, I mean, you got on the one hand a problem where you get a bunch of people who come in with different perspectives,
Yeah.
and over time their perspectives tend to, blend, and presumably you want to kind of hold that off to some extent. But then there's other situations where you might just bring in a relatively homogeneous group, and you could potentially stimulate some divergence of opinion, right? I mean, to what extent do we sometimes take perspectives as given,
Right.
right? And essentialistic and non-malleable.
I think I think you're raising a great point. I think that, like, think about these kids coming into college. They're 18, 19. Some of them are ridiculously sophisticated compared to maybe like what you and I were. We had 40 years ago when I was an undergrad, 45 years ago. But um, some of them are really, really just aware of multiple ways of thinking. They've had lots of rich life experiences. They've read a lot. They're really worldly. Others are coming in like kind of where I came from like small rural schools, and it's just kind of overwhelming. I mean, I think that if we're not doing our job in Michigan, or you're not doing your job at Berkeley, if they leave, I mean, let's go back to the models book. If they don't leave much, much more sophisticated thinkers, I do wonder if we're kind of like attaching people to ideology, so much, or to race so much coming in, that we're thinking that that's like some fixed part of who you are, this way of looking at the world, when in fact people are going to adopt multiple ways of seeing things, we hope. They're going to change their convictions. You know, new new facts will cause rethinking. I think it's again, this is where I think the culture of university should be one that like we don't know. We're going to tell you what is currently known, but we see everything is open to kind of like interpretation. Genetics is a great example, right? Remember we were saying not that long ago, like, no, we're mapping a human genome so we'll know which genes cause which diseases,
Right.
right? Now that looks silly.
Yeah.
It just looks silly, right?
Well, but if you're curating a group of perspectives,
Yeah,
there's no reason why you would ex ante think that the optimal mix would reflect in any way, I don't know, the distribution of those perspectives in any given group, right?
right,
I mean, I remember we did some studies on our MBA students, and the learning styles of the MBA students were, very different from what we would want optimally, right?
right, yeah, yeah, right,
Like, and so we try to, I don't know, get them to think in different ways.
right,
And a lot of people are saying, no, 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 you just got to admit more people. But if we admit more people with let's say, noticing
right,
mindset, then we're going to have a much higher admit rate for the people who come in with that characteristic, because we're trying to create that optimal palette
right.
of perspectives. So I mean, do we sometimes default to, I don't know, um demographic numbers when right? I mean, for instance, we might want to have overweighting or underweighting of particular groups if to get to that optimal portfolio of perspectives.
Nina Woolley and Tom Malone, this work on kind of like collective IQ, right? And this was with MIT students, and they found that individual IQ score didn't determine how well a team did. At first, they found more women meant the team did better. But then when they had people take the eyes and the mind test, can you read facial expressions? Women tend to score higher on that than men. And that was actually the explanatory variable. But again, now you're taking MIT MBAs,
Right.
which may not be the highest scores on the eyes and the mind test. So it could be that having one of those people help a lot, right? We found when we looked at, again, not we know that much data. But when you look at kind of like what leads to success in graduate school, there's some departments like mathematics. Like if you don't score 80 or above in the math subject test, you just don't get a PhD in math. I mean, you just don't make it because it's just hard. I mean, that test works pretty well. It's like, can you do math, right? Um, but in other fields, we found like large cohort effects. So imagine taking like a lot of people interested in sociology would be a good example, aren't necessarily data people, but there are some people who are really interested in, like, just really love data. Well, to make it as a sociologist, there's just a level of kind of like understanding data you've got to get. You don't have to be a PhD level mathematician or physicist, but you got to be okay. And so what you'll find there is that like there's kind of a threshold, maybe not like a line at 600 points or something, but like you can't be really bad at, you can't not be able to add and subtract and make it in Soch. But you've got to be pretty good. But if you've got someone in your cohort that's really good, like a couple people,
Yeah.
and they're helpful people, everybody does really, really well, right? And so there you get like, from a cohort perspective, having a little bit of variation on the upper tail in kind of quantitative ability helps everyone. But then here's another example. We had a case at Michigan in one of our departments in the social sciences. We had a former police officer who came back to grad school, and I actually learned that like you, if you score too highly on tests, you shouldn't be a police officer because you like break rules, you question rules, like you follow the rules. So this person was basically kind of like, in some ways, like too questioning of rules to be a good police officer, what makes you a very good academic. But you throw in, let's suppose I just picked on SAT score and grade point average and letter recommendations, and not to stereotype, that means I'm going to be choosing rich kids from Connecticut and Palo Alto and Ann Arbor. Like I'm going to be choosing privileged people. Now you throw in a 35-year-old cop into that graduate program. Everybody wins.
Yeah, but if we're doing individual performance metrics, then we're often going to fail to pick up on the kind of beneficial
Well,
effects,
that's what I
right?
mean.
The
But
spillover
everybody
effects.
else benefited from this from
Yeah.
being in the class, right? Because when you're
Uh,
talking about crime, you're talking about poverty, you're talking about
yeah.
policing, having that person in every one of those discussions made everybody a better social scientist,
And
right?
so I know in sports, right?
Yeah,
I mean, the analytics movement focused initially on individual performance metrics.
right,
And now I think it's gotten a little more sophisticated and can sort of look at how you help to make your teammates better.
right.
And I think in the world of HR analytics, we're starting to, understand this and incorporate this. Um, in academia, I mean, it seems like you point to how co-authorship is exploding relative to
Oh,
where it
yeah,
was, say,
crazy,
100
right?
years
Yeah,
ago. And so there may be some co-authors out there who are, really good at making their co-authors better, right? Um, and so, how do we evaluate that? Because typically at the PhD level, we don't want our candidates to be submitting chapters that are co-authored as part of their dissertation, let's say, right? That we want everything to be individual work.
yeah. So you're in this like the one of my friends uses this phrase evidentiary phenomena. So one of the things that happens is like with these, like if you have somebody listed as a co-author, then it's like you're basically saying you helped me a lot, right? And
Yeah.
professors vary in terms of how often they put themselves as co-authors on their students' papers. And it's a mixed blessing because if you take your name off, they get full credit. If you put your name on, it may get more citations, right? And so it's not clear necessarily from a purely strategic standpoint what makes the most sense. But if you look at to your point about curating, one of the reasons I think why co-authored papers and we see diverse co-authored papers do a lot better is the curation. Like I'm trying to do something, I'm stuck, right? So I call in someone I know who's like really good at math or really good at, difference in difference or whatever it is I need someone to do, right? And then they're a co-author, but it wasn't like we sat around and used our diverse minds to come up with a good idea. It was like, no, I got stuck. And so I bring in this person who's got the skill set. A good example is, Bob Solow, who's a very, very, very good economist, like, one of the best last 100 years. Supposedly, he never had a paper rejected or even with revised and resubmitted. Every person would accept. And I know Bob, I knew Bob a little bit, his son and grandson better, but like the you're thinking, oh my God, how smart is this guy? Right. But then you read Solo's, you talked about, you read his stuff. He talks about how MIT was this just cauldron of ideas and challenges. And so he would present things multiple, multiple times to like the really smart people at MIT's econ department. And of course, then it got accepted on the first pass because it already gone through a gauntlet. But those people don't get listed as co-authors, right? So it's interesting when you look at like, I mean, and I'm sure there's people who kind of do this work, but it comes down to norms. But like the best work is often presented at like 10 or 15 different schools, right? And has people, um, filtering through. So how do you
Critiquing
do
and
that?
giving feedback and
Yeah,
yeah.
and this is right. And this is, but to your point about like back to these departments, though, this is what really worries me is like during COVID, everybody built offices at home. People don't come in as much. Like I might as well put like, you know, should March Canaro on the offices next to me. It's like if the people aren't coming in, who cares? I mean, who
Right.
cares if there's a famous person in my department if they're only in 4 hours a week?
Yeah.
Whoop de do, right? So how do you kind of like in order for that the kind of like diversity to come in order for to think of like what is the real benefit of these people in the department, you've got to be interacting with each other. Because I think there's people who've added enormous value, like Michael Cohen, my former colleague who was a March student, um, enormous value to people's work because they were just genuinely thoughtful people who read things and who, you know, gave hard comments, right? Um, which is difficult to do, right? But
Well, look, I mean,
yeah,
in your work, you talk about having sort of diverse models, right?
yeah,
And, boosting and bagging and so forth. And then you also talk about having, diverse teams with
yeah,
people
yeah,
with different backgrounds. But I think now, I mean, we could talk about combining the two, right?
right,
And there's been all this work on agents and how you can sort of, create teams of agents
right.
to interact with each other and
Yeah,
debate
yeah,
each.
yeah,
I
yeah,
did
yeah.
this
No,
once
right,
on a consult. I did this once on a consulting project. I said, take all the people that are going to be coming in for the consulting project and have them, debate stuff. And it turned
right,
out to be a pretty good replica of what actually transpired. So you could, and you wind up getting better output when you have these agents interact. And then if you go up one level and you have, well, individuals collaborating. So if I want to have someone on my team who has a particular perspective and I look around and it's lacking, I could just kind of spin it up and say, all right,
right,
I need the AI to take the, devil's advocate position. I want them to, be the red team. I want them to stress test this. Does this kind of really open up the possibility of, um, I don't know, filling in the gaps that we might find difficult to fill in if we relied entirely on humans, let's say?
okay. So this is I've had a bunch of conversations about exactly this question. Like, so is success in life? I mean, again, how do you find success? But is kind of like having kind of an easier path. How much of this is like every single little decision I've just been a little bit better, and how much of this has been like don't buy the house with the wet basement. I mean, like, to like the not making the really stupid decision, right? Like he's cute, but he's bipolar. We just get the kind of thing like, decisions that just maybe not a good idea, right? Um, and so if it's the latter, if it's that people who have more social capital, people whose families have more connections to people and things like that, and people who've been kind of better trained are better able to make the big decisions. If that's the if that really is a big contributor to success, then I'm super optimistic because you can imagine. Let's take even buying a house. You and I, by it's 1:30, right by my time, by 2 o'clock, we could build a bot that sort of said, okay, feed in all the information from my house. Let's think from an engineering perspective, what are the potential risks, right? Let's throw in the city plan. Let's look at kind of like long-term city planning, what might be the risk. And let's just look at like comparables, right? Let's look at like basic things like roof quality, things like this. Let's look at kind of like how costly it would be to expand. Let's think, just we could just have a set of profiles of types of frames one could apply to this big housing investment. And then you could throw it in and, someone's looking at buying a house, it could say, no, don't do that. Right. Or yes, this seems like a fine decision, or just even give people some sense of what the risk is. Or, and I think even better advice in that situation would be like, say, this is a fine house, but you probably need 50,000 in cash that you have access to because there's 4 or 5 things that can go wrong. Probably what if they do, you'd be underwater and it would be bad. Like even if it was just giving you that number, that could be super useful to people. And if and so I think that those sort of right now you and I can hack one and a smart person can hack one.
So this would be a way of using AI to sort of identify your blind spots.
Well, or even to just allow people to have better, you know, decision making protocols for I mean, like, is it the case that like buying a house, buying a car, like going to
Or even
college?
buying a refrigerator. I spent like 3 hours on Home Depot trying to figure out like, how to buy a refrigerator.
No, my wife, I don't remember those old these are like three of my favorite ads. ING used to have these ads where these people are shaking a cantaloupe. They're like, pounding it, sniffing, stuff. And it goes on for, I don't know, 30 seconds, but it seems like forever. And then the tagline was like, are you spending time on the important decisions? Right.
Right. Yeah.
And so my wife and I use the phrase shaking the cantaloupe, right? Like whenever we're spending
Uh-huh.
way too much time on like a
Right.
35-cent decision. But I think the thing is that like we're afraid to ask other people. Like I know like what shirt you wear, I know what music you listen to, I maybe know what car you drive. But like I don't know how much you donate to charity, how much you saving for retirement, you see guidelines like you know, like we were told in Michigan, like, here's how much you should spend on your house as a function of your income. And then we spent the year at Stanford, and that number was double. No, because
Only
housing,
double?
no, because housing is just so much more expensive.
Right.
If you said spend 3.5 times your income on housing, everyone would be in an Airstream trailer parked along El Camino Real, right? Um, and so people just spend more, and we're like, how do you do it? And they do it by like shopping at Costco. I mean, like people have, and so and so you realize, like, depending on where you are, what counts as what counts as a smart decision is it can vary. But I also think that people who come from families who have are well socially connected, who have wealth, who are educated, they get good advice on big decisions that maybe other people don't get. And you can go to the internet to get advice, but you're going to get it pointing in 1,000 directions. The question is, will there be ways to have, like, will banks, will they develop AI that they say, look, okay, we're going to approve this, but why don't you know, use this software and go through this process, and it may help you think about particular things.
Yeah, but you could also say, for instance, you're thinking of launching a new product, and you
Yeah.
could say, look, maybe I don't have a Latino on my team. And so I
Right.
say, all right, like, let's ask the AI, right?
Right.
Take a look at this product from the perspective
Oh,
of
yeah.
a sort of, Latino, and tell me what you think, right? There may be ways that you could, I don't know, simulate the kind of diversity that you're, finding it difficult to simulate inside the team.
I think it's where it's probably most useful now is there's a certain sort of like cultural appropriation that people do, like, whoa, like you've taken all the knowledge of this particular group, and now you're not actually asking me, but you're asking a reflection of me. That I find troubling there. But the thing is, but I do think, though, if I wanted to say, I want to consult with a friend of mine, or go out and meet with some people who maybe have some expertise in this area, and I want to make sure I phrase this in a way, I want to make sure I present the problem in a way that, like, is going to make this interaction as good as possible. I mean, it's strange, because if you think about, if I could create a very diverse set of, like, artificial advisors who I, like, talk to all the time, and, like, they can tell me what music to listen to, and I could have, like, this diverse set of artificial friends, but that'd be very different than real diverse artificial friends, right? Just because, like, real friends do stuff where, like,
They don't conform to stereotypes,
no,
right?
and also
So
they do, like, crazy stuff. Like, we had friends, I mean, you don't know who they are, but so what? Like, we got invited to a dinner party last night, and the person, the person typed in the wrong time. So we showed up at the end of dinner, but God seemed like a late time. And then everybody's like, what are you guys doing here? We're like, and so and then we're both, like, looking at each other, and you could take out your phones and decide who gets thrown under the bus here. But we just decided, nah, somebody screwed up. People screw up. We're people. Everybody gets, this is fun. This is how the world works. This is good. But your artificial friends don't do that, right? And in some point, things like that make friendships stronger, right? Because you have these, fun, real experiences. And also, even, I think the thing is, like, there are things like, how do we think about what role does being on time play? Like, the cultural differences, like, just between, like, every organization I visit, every university I visit, every family you visit, it's almost like a different country in its way, right? But there's also this kind of, like, coherence to it. And one of the things that, like, I've been trying to get more interested in, but I can't figure out, I've written 10 papers on it, but I still don't know if I'm saying anything, is that I was trained by people in mechanism design, or kind of like, okay, how do you design a market? How do you design a democracy to get a good outcome? But what comes for free, whether you like it or not, whenever I design an institutional structure, an organizational structure, are the norms, the behaviors, the beliefs, the networks, all that other stuff, the kind of, like, dark matter that really matters for society. My friend Jeff Mulligan calls it. And so how do we design, especially now with AI, institutions, organizations, whether they're for-profits, universities, governments, that creates, you know, better people in a way, right? I mean, we're so focused on the allocation. Or the decision that's being made. At the end of the day, the decisions and the allocation is going to be made by those people. So you're getting the outcome, but you're also getting the people. And how do we kind of, and so, and to your point about like the treatment, you also want those people to be diverse, right? And you want to, kind of like allow them and encourage them to be learning new things. And so in fact, I think you don't want to solve it because you couldn't solve it because it would be like social engineering. But I think you want to have some awareness that particular institutional structures and set of structures that you're putting in place aren't necessarily creating the world you want or are creating the world you want. And you go into some places and they just seem so healthy, or you go into some families and they seem so healthy just in terms of like, how people are encouraged to think for themselves, but at the same time, they'll be like, that is such bullshit. Like, they'll call people out, and people that are willing to be called out, right? That's, then you go to other places where you just feel like it's so toxic underneath, but even though on top, everybody's saying, Greg, thank you for sharing that. That was such a beautiful statement. And that they don't, like, no truth is being said between anyone.
Well, I think you're describing a problem that is like COVID or like inequality, right? Which is, organizational design, which does require that you have a little bit of expertise in mechanism design, a little bit of expertise in organizational behavior, right?
And psychology,
all of the
right.
other things, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, Scott,
Yep.
Scott, thanks so much for joining me. This is fantastic. We didn't even really dig into more of the stuff on diversity and inclusion, and hopefully we maybe can revisit on another date.
We lived it. We lived it though, so that was good.
Yeah. But everyone should check out the Model Thinker and Diversity Bonus and the Difference and Complex Adaptive Systems and all of the articles that you've written. They're wonderful. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks. This was big fun.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.